Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time. We're the weekly alternate history podcast that sometimes makes it weekly. We apologize again for being a little on again, off again, but we're getting back in our rhythm here. Don sitting in the host chair here, and I'm happy to be joined this week by Mr. Eric Darling Bond. Eric, I would let you say hi to the good people, but as I mentioned earlier, the letter that I received from Chris Coppola's attorney, cease and desist that he's the only one that's allowed. So I'll just let you say hi.
Hello. I'm sorry. I don't know what else I can say.
Well, there you go.
Chris knows some powerful people.
He knows some powerful people, and there's always the risk that if you cross him, who knows? Your prize racehorse's head may end up in your bed, right? So we have to worry about that. Most of the time is we handle some pretty heavy historical topics, but we like to do what I call the whimsical topics a little more frequently, and that's where we're going to go tonight. And Eric, the question that is just obviously there with our topic tonight that I hope that you know the answer to, I just have to ask is, why are there so many songs about rainbows?
Don, I'm not concerned about rainbows. I'm concerned about what's on the other side.
Maybe that's why there are so many songs about rainbows.
Yeah.
You might have guessed from that. That would be probably the most well-known vocal stylings of Kermit ever. Is that a fair thing to say, Eric? Do you think that would be Kermit's number one all-time on the greatest hits list?
I would say so, though I do play the Moving Right Along song whenever Grace and I go on a road trip.
Okay, so there you go. So it's not just Rainbow Connection. He's more than a one-trick frog, I guess, is the point there. But Kermit is a representative sample of popular culture because he's a Muppet, probably he and Miss Piggy being the most famous Muppets. Again, I'm taking a guess there, Eric, based upon my thing there, but all of that comes from the mind of who?
It all comes from the mind of Greenville, Mississippi's own James Maury Henson, or Jim Henson, as he's more commonly known.
Yeah, and so I think it's one of the, when the topic was suggested here and we were talking a little bit off podcast, the thing that popped into my head, Eric, was that I was born in the late 60s, so I grew up in the era of Sesame Street being on PBS, the Muppet Show being in syndication and, playing on one of the network broadcasts, one of the networks in my town in syndication. And then the things that would come after that, things like Fraggle Rock on HBO and things like that. So I don't think I can remember a time in my life where there hasn't been something Jim Henson around in some way, shape, form, or fashion. That's probably true of a lot of people, certainly. And as I get older and people my age, that's probably true there. So you're younger than I am, Eric. So what was your first exposure to Jim Henson? And when you hear Jim Henson, I know what pops into my head. What pops into your head first?
Well, I'm more familiar with the post-Henson years. So my first Jim Henson experience, or at least with the Muppets, would have been the Muppet Christmas Carol starring Michael Caine. And then Muppet Treasure Island with Tim Curry, who is a living Muppet.
Right. And so in your thinking, when you think Muppets, you immediately actually go to movies and longer form things as being, the first thing that pops into your head, right?
Absolutely. I think I watched the original Muppet movie just because I was told Bob Hope was in it, and my grandparents made me watch the Road to movies whenever I was sick. And that might have influenced a lot of my life, if I'm being honest.
Why did you turn out this way? It's Bob Hope's fault. I'm just telling you, it's Bob Hope's fault.
It's Bob Hope's fault and Bing Crosby and Dorothy Lamour in the good ones.
I was going to ask, to what extent do you what's the blame split on Hope Crosby? But that's a whole other discussion for a whole other time, maybe for one of our live streams.
Yeah, let's just leave it as I Road to Utopia was my favorite one just because Bob Hope got the girl because everyone assumed Bing Crosby was dead. But let's leave it there.
Wow. I have so many things that are running through my head, but we would just be chasing rabbits and not frogs in this case. So we're not even going to do that. So I think it's interesting that we're separate. The generational difference between the two of us causes us to think of even Henson in different ways. Again, I think more of the TV stuff. You think more of the theatrical movie release stuff. But Henson had a long, distinguished career, and obviously we're going to be talking about an alternate history here. So his career comes to an end not because he retired, right, Eric?
That is correct. Unfortunately, he developed toxic shock syndrome.
Okay.
So he started reporting that he had a sore throat and was developing a cough, rashes, shortness of breath. Now, this being the early 90s, he dies May 16th of 1990 from his condition. It could also, I imagine that at that time, a lot of people would also be worried, like, well, is this related to HIV/AIDS? Just
Right.
because those were similar enough symptoms. But essentially, what the working conclusion is, he essentially worked himself to death.
And we're going to talk a little bit about that because what we're going to take off as our point of departure here is him not dying. So that's the reason setting up how he comes to that. And a lot of people, when you hear about the Muppets, people think Jim Henson, true also, but Frank Oz was a collaborator of his. And one of the things that struck me is that Oz stated in a 2021 interview that he thought it was the Disney deal that probably killed Jim and made him sick. So when we talk about the Disney deal, that's relevant to the time that we're talking about. I think it's going to be relevant to our what if path. So Eric, do you want to sort of lead us up? I mentioned the Sesame Street should go without saying. The Muppet Show, being in the 70s, I guess into the 80s, the Muppet movies, the various ones that were there, Fraggle Rock, as I mentioned on HBO. But by the time we get to Henson being sick here, what is the Disney deal that we're talking about here?
Oh, well, going into this, I had assumed that Henson was trying to fight off Disney buying, but now doing some more research here on my side. In 1989, Henson entered into negotiations to sell Henson Studios to Walt Disney for $150 million, just because he wanted to get back more into puppeteering.
Right. At this point, the Muppets had grown into he was not a performer. He was really an executive managing an enterprise by this point, right?
Yeah, apparently part of it was Disney wanted him to stick around as kind of a Walt Disney, Colonel Sanders, or Stan Lee for, fans of the current MCU. In that kind of like, oh yeah, he's the face of this, but maybe he doesn't do all that much aside from just a general oversight. Right. But he had wanted to just get back into, I just want to perform because the business part is sucking my life.
Yeah. And, $150 million is a lot of money at any time. $150 million back in 1990 is, substantially more in 2023 inflation adjusted dollars. And so he's let's see how old he was. At the time of his death, he was 53. 53 is young. I think 53 is young because I'm 55. So 53 seems really young to me, Eric. So he had been around, again, came to fame very young. And so he's still young enough guy that you would tend to think that he has some stuff in front of him, right?
Exactly. And at this time, that's still very young, even talking about when you could smoke actively on airplanes and it was normal.
Right. Understood. It's interesting, when I've been in places where it's still allowed, like, casinos in Las Vegas and things like it's like, oh, this is what the norm used to be all the time. And I can remember being on flights as a teen that, they had smoking sections on the plane then because, the smoke wasn't going to drift in this small contained tube at all, so it meant, didn't make a difference there.
No,
so,
whenever I go to my great grandparents' house, it's just 40 years of caked in smoke. And now every time I smell that. It's like, oh, it's like the Christmas season.
Yeah, exactly. I grew up at home with parents that smoked, so I know that feeling once I got away and then came back to it. So I understand there. So again, our break is going to be here that Henson doesn't die at the age of 53 in 1990. And Eric, is it fair to assume that what happened with the Disney deal after Henson died?
Basically, after he passed away, it was largely split among his children who were working together as part of a trust. But it fell to his third son, Brian Henson, who was also a puppeteer, a director, a producer with the company. And he became the chairman of Jim Henson Company. So he started taking the reins on. So he would be the one to develop Muppet Christmas Carol and the Muppet Treasure Island, directing both of them.
Okay, so those films are, again, it's the Henson heritage that's there, but obviously Jim has gone away. So our point of departure is going to be that Jim Henson either doesn't get sick or survives or recovers from this infection issue in 1990. So Eric, I'm going to go ahead.
The common consensus is if he had seen a doctor before then, he would have been fine.
Right.
So,
and it's a shame we don't have our resident in-house medical expert here, the other Eric Rush, because I'm sure you could tell us the do's and don'ts of that, and also give us the public service warning that announcement that we need that goes with that. So I mentioned, Eric, this is a topic you're probably going to take more on the lead on. I'm going to be a little bit along for the ride and play the role of the audience who happens to be on the recording here. Henson's 53, but he lives. What difference does it make? What do you see as being the alternative there? You mentioned his son took over. What do you see the alternative with Jim Henson still at the helm? Maybe not the helm of the corporation even so much anymore because he's sold to Disney, but being at the creative helm of what's going on there.
Well, I think right away we can say he would probably take the lead, maybe not still directing Muppet Christmas Carol and Muppet Treasure Island.
And we lost Eric on audio for a second. Can you hear me,
We're
Eric?
now dealing with, I'm just going to assume David brought on, because at this time at the casino in Las Vegas and in Walt Disney World. So moving forward, he probably just becomes kind of more of a mentor figure. He probably does put more on his son, Brian, to be the executive in charge, whereas he can now have his creative freedom. Unfortunately, Jim Henson was separated from his wife in 1986. They were still married, but apparently just the pressure of him constantly being at work really just led to the dissolution of his marriage, which unfortunately happens with a lot of creative types once you kind of lose sight of yourself.
Right.
So we're seeing him more taken into the role of like kind of a Stan Lee, for the Marvel generation, to where he's like a living mascot for the Muppets.
So in future Muppet movies, we would all be looking for the Jim Henson cameo, just like we looked for the Stan Lee cameos in the MCU universe.
Exactly. Jim Henson is a living Muppet.
He's a living Muppet.
Yeah. But so it's... Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, one thing we had talked about off podcast is I was trying to think back to the time of what was going on there. And this is a weird time. I don't even know what to call things that I'll just call it broadly, for lack of may have a better term for this. Not even the things that are not live action, either TV or movies. So, puppetry falls into that category. Animation falls into that category for me. Again, the things that are not exclusively live actors. I mean, the thing about, like the Muppet movies, for example, you mentioned the Muppet Christmas Carol, you said Michael Caine. it's not a Muppet of Michael Caine. It's Michael Caine interacting with Muppets. But if you understand what I'm saying here, just sort of the genre that is not, just a pure live action movie with actors. This is before Pixar has risen to be what it is. Animation is still there, but animation pre-Pixar and pre some of the other big animation stuff from Disney, like, Lion King and things like that. Is it a fair thing to say, or am I remembering this incorrectly, Eric, that, Hollywood is sort of stumbling around with what to do with things that aren't live action at this point?
I would say so. This is like right in the middle of the Disney Renaissance.
Right.
We're right in the middle of that. Michael Eisner is the head of Disney. He's having his falling out with Jeffrey Katzenberg, who's trying to develop DreamWorks. Spielberg is dealing with Amblin. Like, he's going to have, unfortunately, a failed production of Fievel Goes West. Spielberg is also trying to negotiate an animated adaptation of Cats at the same time with Andrew Lloyd Webber, because they lived in the same apartment building.
And so, like you said, we're in the midst of the Disney Renaissance, and some big things are about to come from Disney. So the fact that Disney is out there looking to acquire a creative talent with the licensing and the characters that it can build upon that are already there from a Henson shouldn't be a surprise, right? That Disney's in that mode at all. And the expectation was you're not just buying, access to characters that you can then use as you see fit, the Kermits and Miss Piggies of the world, from the Muppet lineup and all the other things that are there, but you're getting access to the guy who's created that.
Exactly. It's about the brand.
Right.
And this is, in a weird way, it kind of is a prelude to what we would see then in the 2000s when Marvel is acquired by Disney.
Right.
And soon Star Wars as well.
Yeah, I was actually just thinking through the idea of what, Disney theme parks would have looked like in the mid 90s, and then subsequent to that, with more of that presence there. I'm particularly thinking back to when we visited Disney World. Alexis and here on this episode to talk about this, but we went to Disney World, if I remember correctly, I think in 96. It's either 95 or 96. And, by that time, Toy Story had come and gone. At that time, what the MGM studio, the MGM was the studio park there in Florida with them. They hadn't acquired Marvel yet, and they hadn't acquired Star Wars. If you haven't been to Disney World or Disneyland in forever, but I know now it's heavily Star Wars, it's heavily Marvel for all the reasons that it is, because Disney owns that. And so I guess my first question to you is, what do you think would have been different from the Henson Company with Jim still around versus Brian being in charge creatively?
I would like to say there would probably be another Muppets TV show attempt, maybe another Muppets Late at Night that we had seen as well. That would probably be my biggest prediction there as a TV project. We definitely would never have gotten the, what was it, 2001, 2002. It was basically A Wonderful Life, but with Kermit, and Kermit is considering, what if I just never started the Muppets? And it's basically a who's who of the NBC television lineup, so that never happened.
Those specials we used to have back in the 70s and 80s. Yeah.
Yeah, it's weird. Comic the Insult Dog shows up at one point, and it's just so weird.
Yeah.
And strange. And still available on Disney Plus.
Because
I don't know how that works legally, but
Yeah. So one of the things I was thinking about as I was reading some of the biography here, I had forgotten that he was he had directed Labyrinth. Is that correct?
Yes, that was his big feature film, Labyrinth, and then Dark Crystal were his two big events, because he was really kind of like how James Cameron is currently about the Avatar franchise, where he's much more interested in world building. He was pouring obsessive details into these picture ideas, but they just weren't coming to fruition. It's kind of like golden age sci-fi. There's a lot of explanation about how things work and how,
Right.
it's all this great idea, and people are saying, and the story is what?
Right. That was 10 wonderful minutes of exposition. What exactly happened? Yeah, and I was thinking, back to that, and again, thinking back on that movie. It's been a long time since I've seen Labyrinth, for example, but I remember David Bowie is in there. A very young Jennifer Connelly is in that movie, as I recall. I think she was one of the leads there. And I guess it's fair to say that between that and Dark, he was exploring things that really weren't, his rise to fame was in doing puppetry that was children's work. But Henson wasn't just about containing his puppetry work to a children audience. He wanted to do darker things, bigger things.
Right. It was like, even if you watch old episodes of The Muppet Show, like, he's making a lot of adult centered jokes that just goes over most kids' heads, but you appreciate it more as you get older.
Yeah. And so, sort of circling back to the same question as before, given the direction he was trying to move in, let's jump forward, let's say 10 years later. What kind of things do you think we would have seen coming out of, the Henson parts, the Disney controlled Henson brain trust here with Jim at the helm?
Well, I think there's probably going to be a bit of conflict, when you ever have like these overarching ideas or overarching executives, because there's going to be Eisner, who will want to try and franchise it out as much as possible. I think we lose Toontown. I think we get rid of Toontown and it just becomes a Muppet City.
Okay.
That's my main idea for the theme parks. I think we would probably get a new Muppet TV show for the Disney Channel, which might be just a little bit more centered on children.
Right.
Heck, it could even replace Sesame Street, which would be a very strange thought. Like, I don't even know what that negotiation would be like.
Yeah, and I think you hit upon something there that I think is interesting exploring, because I think inevitably it probably would not have been a happy marriage all the way through with a creative type like Henson, given, what he had brought to the fore, creatively to that point in his career. And to your point, when the folks that are spending the money and therefore they are calling the shots are wanting you to produce things that can be franchised and, by the way, marketed and, all the other, and to a point, I don't think he would have been opposed to that. But when you get into the whole creatives, when it becomes the creatives versus the commercial, that can sometimes turn a little bit ugly.
Yeah, and who's to say he doesn't fall into bad habits again, where he has to take a more robust executive role, at which point you can say, like, but wasn't that the reason you sold to Disney in the first place, was you wanted to just focus on the creative aspects? So there's always that give and take, that push and pull of how much power are you willing to give up to be personally satisfied with the product?
Right. Right. And the thing, are you familiar at all? We didn't talk about this off podcast. Are you familiar at all with, it's one of my favorite YouTube things, the pitch meetings on YouTube?
Oh, yeah, I've seen a couple of those. Those are great.
Yeah. And I enjoy them, and I enjoy I can't think of the Canadian comedian who does them now, but they're well done. If you've never seen them, I'll put a link in the show notes to the Screen Rant page where they are. But it's the concept of, it's the dual person playing both roles talking to. So it's the same guy coming in, giving the pitch for the movie. And it's going to be a movie that and there's some great taglines from inside of that. If you've never seen this, I encourage you to see it, audience. It's one of my favorite things. But the conflict in the pitch meeting and the humor of that is always around the creative coming in and pitching, and the studio executive, trying to figure out how to monetize this thing. And so sometimes the pitch becomes, but we can sell a lot of that. Oh, we can sell we can sell a lot of, whatever. Okay, yeah, make that, even if it's a bad creative idea. And so to me, there's always that interesting tension that exists between a creative like Henson, or even a creative, like you mentioned some of the others, a Spielberg or somebody else, when the studio embraces and gives them their creative vision. Sometimes masterpieces can be created. You can also get some really weird stuff that's not good because there's nobody willing to tell them no. But there tends to sometimes be that tension that exists. And that tension can bring good things or bad things.
Yeah, like an infamous example of someone maybe having too much control at the expense of others, like Andrew Lloyd Webber. Like
Yeah,
he's kind of been coasting off of his own brand from Jesus Christ Superstar to Evita to Joseph and his amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, and of course Phantom, to the point now, like he just opened up on Broadway Bad Cinderella.
yeah,
And
it's
according to the New York Times, they warned us.
and you skipped Cats, which was a great Broadway show and innovative at the time, taking some really obscure bad poetry and making it tolerable. But then done as a bad movie a couple of decades later. But yeah, I think it's, again, that's an interesting thing we talk about Henson not being Henson being there is you logically immediately go to the place of, ooh, what creative things had he never gotten around to that would have come out of his mind if he had lived longer? But then you wonder if he had lived longer in the different environment, whether he would have been allowed to do that, or if he would have spent a lot of time, again, being pulled back into an executive role, less creative role, or in the creative role, feeling stymied by having sold and not having the same level of control that he had before. And then, suddenly there's the Disney Muppets breakup in 2000 because, of creative differences, irreconcilable creative differences.
Exactly. And, coming for my theater fans, there was an adaptation of Into the Woods. Did you ever see the James Corden, Emily Blunt movie?
I did. I like Sondheim's musicals and music, and first of all, Meryl Streep was in that movie, so it can't be bad if Meryl Streep is in a movie. That's just what I believe. It's impossible.
Yeah, it's complicated,
Yeah. But yes, I did.
Yeah, there was an original plan in '89 to try and start adapting it to film with a mixture of live action and Muppet characters, with Jim Henson ideally at the helm. They had signed off. They had gotten it signed off with Stephen Sondheim to look into it. And as late as 1996, they were still trying to get people to develop it and turn it into a full picture.
And the assumption if Jim's alive, it gets done. It probably is done by then, not just trying to figure out how to do it by then, right?
Right. Would you like me to read you the cast that they had in 1994 with Penny Marshall as the director in our own time?
Yeah, I'm curious to know now that you said that.
Okay. Robin Williams as the baker.
Okay.
Goldie Hawn as the baker's wife. Cher as the witch. Steve Martin as the wolf. Danny DeVito as the giant. Yeah, they weren't going to have the giant's wife, apparently. They just wanted the giant to survive the initial fall and then come back, which is an interesting choice, but, Elijah Wood and Roseanne Barr as Jack and Jack's mother. Bebe Neuwirth, Mayim Bialik as the sisters of Cinderella. Brendan Fraser, was going to be one of the princes, along with Kyle MacLachlan.
Kyle MacLachlan in something not directed by David Lynch. I didn't know that was actually possible, but apparently it is.
Stranger things have happened. And Moira Kelly was going to be Cinderella. So imagine that coming out in the mid-90s.
With we presume a smattering of puppetry and animatronics and other things mixed in with it if we're going to have Henson somehow involved with it.
Absolutely. Kind of like Return to Oz, that classic movie that we all love.
Yeah. So what is the state of the Henson empire today? Maybe to contrast that briefly with where it is now and where it may have gone if Jim had still been around?
I think if Jim had still been around, I think he would have retired by now. Just fully retired, turned the reins over to Brian Henson, because I think Disney would definitely want to keep it in the family for at least right now for brand recognition. They probably still buy out Marvel and Star Wars. And especially because of how close George Lucas was with Jim Henson, and they ran in the same circles, as well as Francis Ford Coppola, who was going to produce the Into the Woods musical film. I think there's a lot more of a cohesion of kind of that new Hollywood group aligned with Disney.
I couldn't help but go in my head there, Eric, too. I love the smell of Sondheim in the morning.
Well, Don, you and I both are big fans of Willow 2, not the TV show Willow. Definitely the Willow movie that they would have made a sequel to in the early 2000s.
I always find these episodes interesting when we do them, because I think I had this conversation, I think most recently when Dylan Holzheimer, who's the new member of our team, and I did the thing about Elvis. I think it is very difficult at times to go down the alternate history route with entertainment for a lot of reasons, because it's a creative non-linear thing in many instances. And so when you change the narrative, if you will, the timeline or who's involved, the dynamics are different than they are in regular history. Does that make any sense?
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. To me, I always try to put like a theme to whenever we're doing an episode of just like, what is going to be this unifying idea to like guide our thoughts. And in this one, it's kind of that measure of, I was watching Highlander, and I was thinking about something the main villain says of like, it's better to burn out than fade away.
Yeah.
And it's kind of that thing with Jim Henson. Would it have been better if he was able to make more creative products, but that he had less creative freedom under Disney, but still being alive to push out all of these ideas? Or is it for the best that he burned out the way he did, which is not an easy thing to say about anyone, of course.
I think that's an excellent point. Again, to me, it mirrors again what I was just saying there about what Dylan and I talked about around, Elvis. Is there's a nostalgia that exists for the what if, because you have the what if, which is interesting because we're the what if podcast, but you don't know. It doesn't always mean it would have been good, I guess, is my point. Sometimes we were talking there. We're talking. I guess it was off podcast. I'm a big. Anybody who's listened to the podcast knows this, or even knows the name of our other podcast, which is based off of this. I'm a big Lin-Manuel Miranda fan. I think Hamilton is. There's a reason that it's the acclaim that it is, and that's not to say that In the Heights wasn't good. Miranda had done good stuff before Hamilton, but if you're Lin-Manuel at his age and you've done Hamilton, that's a hard thing to top for the rest of your life. You may have peaked, and that's not a bad thing, but you may have peaked. And, I sometimes wonder, I'm talking about Henson at 53, had he already done his best work? When we talk about, later work was derivative or repetitive, or, he never quite adapted to this. One of the things I mentioned off podcast was, imagine Henson, suddenly getting the bug because he's connected with Disney and because of Pixar, of them getting him to bring his creative vision over, not to puppetry, but, to what was going on with Pixar-based animation.
Yeah, he definitely has that kind of pioneering spirit. The more I'm reading about him, he always wants to try out the new, kind of like a Robert Zemeckis kind of feeling of like he's more motivated by, let's try out this new feat in technology. And sometimes it works. Like, I think it's Death Becomes Her. He's using a lot of new technology to help animate that. And then sometimes it doesn't, with Jim Carrey's A Christmas Carol.
Right. When it works, it works. And when it doesn't, it doesn't. And yeah, to me, it's just curious to think about. We were talking actually off podcast, I guess, and we were talking about Orson Welles. We were talking about Citizen Kane, and imagine somebody with Wells's creativity, the young Wells, long before he was selling no wine before its time. A young Orson Welles with computer animation at his disposal. And all the things that have been developed in film that when we look back on Citizen Kane now, what's so impressive about that? Well, that shot you saw there, that was the first time anybody ever did that, kind of thing. The fact that looks so familiar to you now is because everybody has copied that for the last, coming up on 80 years, a long time. I sometimes think about when somebody like a Henson here, and bring it back to the topic, when they're gone young or too early, and so they didn't make it to a point where technologies or capabilities came along. Did Henson have something in his head that he always wanted to make, that there was just no way to do it with puppets, that suddenly you have computer generated animation that looks as realistic as what we get now, that suddenly once you remove that barrier to Henson, you cross the rainbow, you're way on the other side at that point. Yeah. And sort of, empowering and unleashing, I guess, is the thing that I think about there. And with a Henson, I think that's what's interesting in the what if is, what would he have done with the technology that's come along and the capabilities that have come along in what is now over 30 years since he passed away.
Well, before we close this off, Don, who's your favorite Muppet?
I was afraid you were going to ask that before I had a chance to ask you. I think my favorite Muppet, for better or for worse, is going to be a Kermit. I think it's still there, just because it's easy to go there, and I can identify a little bit more with a Kermit in terms of maybe some of the insecurities and some of the other things that are there. This is going to sound really strange to say. To me, Kermit is a little more human than some of the other Muppets. Yours?
I get that. Being the semi-hipster I am, of course, I go for an obscure one. Bobo the bear. He's typically like the henchman. Like, I think he's the henchman in a Muppets in Space, which we'll say that doesn't happen. But he's more of a non-anthropomorphic bear. And there's just something about his charm that I can't help but like. But Ralph the dog is a close second.
Well, there you go. So if there's a wide range. I will say this: my least favorite Muppet is an easy one for me. It's Miss Piggy. To me, it's almost sort of it's a stick kind of thing. And okay, after 2 minutes of it, this self-absorbed. Okay, I get the joke. I'm done. Move on. Kind of thing. It's like it becomes overkill with her, and that's the very fact that I just referred to a puppet with gender, appropriately so. She is Miss Piggy, but that wears on me after a while, and I guess part of the reason I choose choose Kermit or maybe any of the others from from going back to Sesame Street and or the Muppet Show again for me back into the early. I'm definitely not an Elmo person because I lived through the Baby Elmo craze when my daughter was young and don't want to go back there again. But again, Miss Piggy, my non-favorite. That one's an easy one. I don't even have to think about that one because it's almost a caricature that's there. All right. Yeah. So we've explored a little bit about what would have happened if Jim had lived. I'm now curious. Now I have a couple of things to go back through and watch and refamiliarize myself from the Muppet universe. So that's the other benefit of this topic. So Eric, any closing thoughts before we close out the episode?
Well, Farscape never happened, so maybe I'll try and watch. Maybe I'll finally start that show.
There you go. There you go. All right. Eric, thanks for joining me. I'm going to go ahead and close out the episode here by thanking our listeners once again. Thank you for sticking with us as we've been a little inconsistent with our weekly release schedule. Trust me, I've seen the chat here among the team. We're all anxious to get back in the rhythm of things and get rolling here. It's just, this little thing called real life gets in the way. But we again appreciate our listeners, appreciate you supporting us. If you want to learn more about the podcast, visit the website at www.aforkandtimepodcast.com. There you can find the whole back catalog of the shows, links on how to support, how to make suggestions into the show, and of course, if you're apt to do so and want to do so, how to support us financially through Patreon. And but again, most importantly, we thank you for your time today and the opportunity to share with you a little bit. We hope you come back next time. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.